introducing the keynote speaker. It's very exciting, especially because his story is very similar to mine. So I'll share with you a little bit of my story. So I am an undocumented immigrant. I was born in Chihuahua, Mexico, which is actually just 4 hours away from the US border. When I was 5 years old, my parents told me they were taking me to Disneyland. I was really excited, but it turned out that they took me to Phoenix, Arizona. Not quite the same thing. But I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona. My first year there was definitely very difficult. The language barriers, the culture blocks were very hard, but I soon became bilingual, and I soon managed to kind of assimilate to the American culture. However, the immigration debate really hit Arizona very early on. When I was in middle school, there were protests going on in the city called A Day Without a Mexican. And it really started the questioning of my identity as a Mexican and really questioned my status as well. So these protests had people, the Mexican population in Phoenix, not going to work for a day, kind of trying to prove to the city that they were necessary. And so I started asking my parents, well, I'm Mexican, why are we not at the protest? However, we didn't do anything there. In high school, I started realizing what it really meant to be Mexican in Phoenix. It was not a very good thing to be Mexican in Phoenix. And it really hit hard on my parents, who had a very strong accent. So for them, my mom would tell me not to speak Spanish at the supermarket because she was afraid of what people would say if they heard our language. And I would hear people talking about my dad, calling him a wetback. So those were my experiences early on in high school. However, it wasn't until my junior year of high school that I really realized what my status really meant for me personally. I realized that I couldn't enroll in college classes without paying 3 times as much as my classmates, which was really not feasible. And so I quickly grew very disillusioned with my future. I thought I couldn't go to college. I thought that was just not going to be a possibility for me. My parents never had really explained to me what my lack of status would mean or really talked about it at all. So it was really a new experience for me. However, my school, because I was graduating as valedictorian, they thought that I should have some sort of path for my future, and they figured out that Penn actually admits undocumented students. Thankfully, that coincided with my interest, and so I was accepted into the Wharton School of Business. I'm now a junior studying marketing in undergrad. Hopefully I can get into Penn Law someday. But really I'm sharing this with you all so you can see kind of the trajectory that I had as an undocumented immigrant. When I got to Penn, it was really the first time that I was able to embrace my identity as being a Mexican and an undocumented immigrant. And that was really due to the fact that I joined an organization called Dream Activist Pennsylvania. And I heard them sharing their stories. I heard them really coming out and doing what I'm doing right now. And it was really empowering, and it was really, I guess, very emotional, very important part of my life. And that was just a few years ago. And so since then, I really started to share my story more often, and I've made really different improvements in my life. And so this brings me back to Jose Antonio Vargas, because he actually shared his story just a few months before I shared my story on the Daily Pennsylvanian. So he was actually probably most prominent for winning the Pulitzer Prize in 2008 for covering the Virginia Tech massacre. He has also been a senior contributing editor at the Huffington Post, and his reporting on HIV and AIDS in Washington, D.C. led him to co-produce and write a documentary called The Other City that premiered in 2010, just a few years ago. That same year, he profiled Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook for The New Yorker, so he's really done a lot of prominent things. However, he is definitely most prominent in my eyes for his coming out essay in the New York Times, and that was just in 2011. And here, I'm sure he'll talk about it soon, he shared his own experiences as a Philippines immigrant and really what that meant for him. And I do want to emphasize that all of us that are immigrants in the United States have different stories that sometimes are similar but very different. And also last year, to celebrate the anniversary of his coming out, he wrote a cover story for Time magazine, and I had the pleasure of joining him on the cover of Time magazine, which was a really exciting time, meeting a lot of other undocumented immigrants from across the nation. Jose Antonio Vargas is also the founder of Define American, which is a nonprofit organization that creates dialogue around the meaning of being American. It's really inspired a lot of conversations around citizenship and around this idea of freedom and equality, and really inspires maybe you guys to kind of think about it yourselves and submit a video. Undoubtedly, he's definitely made great strides in the past few years and has brought to prominence a lot of important issues around immigration, but more importantly, he has inspired a lot of people to share their stories and a lot of people to start talking about these issues and start bringing to the forefront this advocacy for immigration reform or for the DREAM Act, for policy in general. So definitely join me in welcoming this great man today, who I'm sure he'll give a great, inspiring presentation.
I don't want to spill coffee in the Penn Law School thing. I would not have gotten into Penn. I was not smart enough. That's for sure. Actually, thank you so much for that really great introduction. I just kind of want to connect the dots a little bit. So I grew up in Bay Area, in Mountain View, California, in the Bay Area. Went to school at San Francisco State. Can you hear me? Is that better? Oh, okay. I thought you were telling me that was being too soft. Great. So I was there before Google got there, so I'm assuming so were you. A long time ago. Okay. So I'll backtrack a little bit, but I just wanted to share this because I got here last night and started walking around, and I realized that I hadn't walked this neighborhood since I lived here. I lived here in the summer of 2000, the innocent summer of 2001. Before the 9/11 attacks, when we became each other's enemies. Remember that time? Or I'm in front of immigration people. I'm sure you remember that time. So I got an internship at the Philadelphia Daily News, which is the scrappy kid ghetto brother, and I mean ghetto in a positive way, of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And so I found a frat house to live in on Craigslist, somewhere in the 40s, some locus. So just imagine, I have never been to the East Coast. I grew up in the Bay Area where there's like Filipinos, Chinese, Indians, all that Mexicans, white people, black people, everybody. Then you get to Philly, and you have this thing called the Wawa. What was that? And then I was just really confused. I remember getting here and like, whoa, it's such a black, this was in 2001, it was such a predominantly black or white town. And even to my benefit, in a way, they assigned me to cover homicides. And that was a pretty busy summer of homicides. I ended up covering 22 homicides in 12 weeks. And I didn't drive, because I couldn't drive, although I told the Philadelphia Daily News that I could drive, just for the hell of it. So, can you imagine hitchhiking and taking SEPTA, the subway system, to get to like West Philly or North Philly for crime scenes? And I just remember the distinct feeling of identity. The fact that I was neither white nor black, and I looked Asian with a name like Jose, and everybody was like, why is your name Jose? I don't think there was any other Filipino in Philadelphia at that point. I hope there were, but I just didn't meet them. So it was a really, I have to say, a very vibrant, amazing, scary, because here I am at like Philadelphia police stations covering homicides as an undocumented person without any sort of ID. But to me, the biggest gift that this city gave me was James Baldwin. I didn't know anything about James Baldwin until the first gay bookstore in the country is called Giovanni's Room. It's on 12th and Pine. If you haven't been there, please check it out. I think it's one of the few gay bookstores remaining in America. And I went to that bookstore. I mean, I didn't know what Giovanni's Room was, and got to meet James Baldwin and his writing and gay literature. So that was a great gift to me. So before I keep going, I just kind of want to contextualize this a little bit more. I am not an activist. I think activism is something that, you know, it has to be more than 2 years. Maria Elena is an activist. She's an advocate. Like, she's been doing this a lot longer than I have. Tanya has been doing this longer than I have. So I'm not an activist. I'm not an organizer. I'm not a leader. I'm none of those things. What I am is I tell stories. That's what I've always done. It just never had to be my story before. I've done 2 documentaries. I'm working on my 3rd one right now on immigration. And my 4th one is going to be on white people. I'm really excited about that. No, I'm doing a documentary on whiteness. I am a writer, and for the past 12 years, I made my living as a journalist. And this is kind of what I want to explain. So as many of you here may know, I came here from the Philippines when I was 12. Didn't find out I was undocumented until I went to the DMV to apply for a driver's permit. And after I showed the woman at the booth my green card and my school ID without telling anybody that I was going to the DMV, I just went. It was 16. Had to get a license. And the woman at the booth said, "This is fake. Don't come back here again." And this is really horrible. The first thing I thought of was, I'm not Mexican. Because I grew up in the Pete Wilson Prop 187 era that in many ways is the granddaddy to like SB 1070 and HB 56 in Alabama, right? Like that was the first time the state of California said that we're gonna take over what the federal government is supposed to do, and we're gonna tell people that we're gonna check their immigration status. So I grew up in that era. And if you're living in California in that era, and you're watching the news, and you're listening to the radio, and you're listening to the rhetoric, quote-unquote illegal meant Mexican. So my first instinct when the woman at the DMV said this to me was like, wait a second, maybe I'm Filipino, yo. Like this is, I actually said something like that to her, and I think she was even more confused, and so I just left. And then I went home and confronted my grandfather because he was home, and that's when he was the one that said, yes, that's fake. Don't tell other people. He said 2 things. 1, what are you doing showing that to people? 2, you're not supposed to be here. Right? Because apparently what ended up happening was, to backtrack, my mother sent me here to live with my grandparents, who are both naturalized American citizens. I thought everything was fine. My mom told me she was going to follow in a couple of years. She never did. But then that's when I started realizing was that immigration was bigger than, quote, a Mexican brown issue, which is still, I gotta tell you, I like to think of myself as a walking uncomfortable conversation. I've been traveling around the country now. I've done maybe 125 events, some Tea Party meetings, some town hall meetings, in 25 states. I just got back from Wisconsin and I was in Iowa. I gotta tell you, like this narrative of this being a Latino issue is cemented in people's minds. Now, mind you, I think at the end of the day, the Latino community has been disproportionately impacted by this in terms of, racism, colorism, right? And the fact that people are being stopped just because they happen to be, quote unquote, look Mexican or look brown. But I just think that's really interesting in the way that how have we allowed the media and us to not connect the dots between the fact that this is an American issue. As old as Ellis Island, as old as Angel Island, it's an issue that impacts all of us, unless you're a Native American, right? Who are really the original Americans. So that's been kind of what I've been going through in terms of going around the country. For me, Tanya shared her story. When I found out I was undocumented, I was 16, I was a freshman in high school. This was in 1997, way before the DREAM Act. I didn't even take the you know how people obsess over the SATs and stuff? I never took the SATs. I stopped taking I made it out of high school taking geometry and biology. I never made it past that. Never took trade, never took physics. I just was, why? What would be the point? I just didn't see the point in like taking the PSATs, or like while I was surrounded by a bunch of kids who were like obsessed about schools. Like that was the time when schools would start mailing their forms. Like Penn would like mail you stuff and like, hey, come to our school. I felt like it was just like a big dare. And then figuring out that because I didn't have like any valid numbers to show people, I couldn't apply for financial aid. My salvation was really the following year when I was a sophomore. My English teacher, Mrs. Dewar, said I was asking too many annoying questions and I should do this thing called journalism. I never even heard of such a thing. Because, you know, we didn't read newspapers at home. My English was really bad. I had a really thick Filipino accent and my written English was like... But I went to this journalism camp, and then I found out that when you write a story, there's a thing called a byline. Right? It says, by Jose Antonio Vargas. Like that. So this is like my first front page story. I covered a fire. And so I thought to myself, I was 17, if I'm not supposed to be here because I don't have the right papers, what if I'm on the paper? I know, like it sounds really silly, but this was my rationale. We never met with any lawyers. I was on the paper. I was writing English. I was interviewing, quote unquote, you know, like Americans. Like, how can they say I don't exist? And I parlayed this into, that's kind of, I was known since I was a sophomore in high school. I was just known as the kid who wrote stories. I would cut classes because I had to cover a city hall meeting in my Hawaiian shorts and a tank top. It was really inappropriate. But I didn't know. I was 17, you know. And let me just break this down even further. To be an undocumented immigrant in this country is to be obsessed with pieces of documents. Your life is ruled by pieces of paper. Let's not forget that. And when I started telling my grandfather, hey, you know, I gotta go get a job, he was like, well, you need a social security card thing if you want to work for Subway. I wanted to make sandwiches at Subway while I was working for the Mountain View Voice. So he bought a social security card. This. Now, my name is accurate. The number, I don't know where he got it from. I'm sorry, we crossed it out. But you see at the very top, people who are immigration lawyers are familiar with this, it says, valid for work only with INS authorization. I didn't know what the hell that meant. All I knew was my grandfather took me to the Kinko's, 4 blocks from the house, cut a piece of white tape, and put it on top of those 2 lines. And then we made 25 photocopies. And that's what I gave Subway sandwiches, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Daily News, the New Yorker, the Pullitzer Committee, and the Huffington Post. Now, I mean, it's kind of funny, but all I tell you is every time I gave them this photocopy thing, I'm like, isn't anybody going to, I don't know, check? I remember when I had to cover a White House state dinner for the Japanese Prime Minister when President Bush was president in 2005. You have to give Secret Service a social security number. So I gave him this number. I'm sitting at my desk at the Washington Post and I'm waiting. Nothing. But I did hear from somebody. I heard from the IRS. Which surprised me even more. They're like, whoa, you owe taxes, dude. I'm like, alright, well, wait a second. So, I started paying taxes. State, federal, in addition to Social Security. To this date, by the way, I paid a total of, I think about $190,000 in federal and state taxes since I started working when I was 18, I counted. And about $45,000 in Social Security that I'm never going to get back. So that to me was really interesting. So I started giving these numbers away and no one would check them. And then when the Washington Post came calling in 2003, so I had gotten the internship in 2001 here. The following year, the Seattle Times offered me an internship in Seattle. And for the first time ever, I told an employer, I told the recruiter, I don't have a driver's license. And I told her everything on the phone. She hung up. She said, I'll talk to our lawyers. Let me get back to you. Then she calls me and she says, Mr. Vargas, we can't have you come here. That was, by the way, the first time that I ended up approaching an immigration lawyer. My high school principal and my high school superintendent, who had become kind of surrogate parents in a way. My grandparents, they were lower middle class people, security guard and food server. They never thought about contacting lawyers. They thought lawyers, and no offense, they just didn't trust lawyers. So my superintendent took me to a lawyer in downtown San Francisco. I'll never forget this. It was right after 9/11. The lawyer said, there's really only one thing he can do, which is go back to the Philippines, accept a 10-year bar. That was the first time I ever heard of that. And then try to come back. So I remember walking out of that meeting with my father figure, my superintendent from high school, Rich Fisher, and we're walking down Montgomery Street in the financial district. And I remember thinking, okay, well, I guess I got to go to the Philippines. And Rich looked at me and he goes, you're not going anywhere. You're already here. And he was the one that said something that was really, for me, incredibly crucial. He said, you gotta compartmentalize this. You gotta put it in a box. I know you have to think about it all the time, but you can't let it stop you. Now, if Rich Fisher, who was like the father figure in my life at that point, said to me, you have to go back, I would have probably gone back. But he said, no, keep going. And so that summer, when I couldn't go to the Seattle Times internship, they took me to Hawaii. He and his family took me to a trip to Hawaii, which is really the only vacation I've ever gotten in my whole life. We went to Hawaii for 3 weeks. It was awesome. Everybody thought it was Hawaiian. It was great. The next summer, I applied for 7 internships, and I got all 7 of them. The Wall Street Journal, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune, and the Washington Post. And I wanted to go to the Washington Post. And I remember my first phone call, 900 people applied for the internship and 20 people get it. The first person I called when they called me about getting the internship was my high school principal, Pat Hyland. And my first question to Pat was, am I taking somebody else's spot? Because that's what we're led to believe. We're led to believe that we're taking someone else's spot, that we're a menace to society, that we're just taking and never giving. And so that was my question. And Pat said, don't be silly. Don't think that way. You earned this. Just go. Okay. But the recruiter at the Washington Post, Cheryl Butler, said, you can't show up here without a driver's license. I was 22. I'd never driven. I found out that there's this thing called federalism, in which every state has its own requirements for a DMV license, for a driver's license. So I spent 10 hours at the Mountain View Public Library printing out the requirements for each one of the 50 states and realized that there were 2 states where you could get a license, Oregon and Tennessee. You put the map down and you're like, Tennessee's over there, Oregon's over there, I'm going to go to Oregon. All I had to do was show my college ID, a pay stub. I was working for the San Francisco Chronicle at the time with this social security number, and a residency. Thankfully, a friend had just moved to Portland. She gave me her address. Off I went. I know, isn't this your nightmare? Your driver's license blown up. Here it is. Hey, why hide anything now? As you can see, I got it on June 4th, 2003. And it expires 8 years later on February 3rd, 2011, which happens to be my 30th birthday. So I figured I had 8 years to write my way into America. That was the goal. I had 8 years to prove myself, to be successful enough to be considered an American, because I thought being American was something you earned, and write my way into it. So, now, I'm sharing this with you, not as a matter of pride. I had to do what I had to do. I had to do what I had to do. But it's to kind of show you kind of just the thinking, and I guess someone said to me, it's like Catch Me If You Can, but like in a really twisted way. But I did this for 8 years. I was at the Washington Post for 5 years. I covered a presidential campaign for 2.5 years that I couldn't even participate in. I couldn't vote in it. And everything snapped, for me at least, in the fall of 2010. That's when I started watching videos on YouTube of this thing called Undocumented and Unafraid National Coming Out Marches in Chicago. And then you put it on YouTube, Undocumented and Unafraid, and all these videos will pop up. I'm like, I remember sitting at my office at the Huffington Post in New York and thinking, what do you mean undocumented and unafraid? I'm afraid! What are you talking about? How can you not be afraid? And then I landed the biggest news, for me, the biggest story of my life, which was Mark Zuckerberg for the New Yorker, before the Social Network, the Facebook movie came out. And the headline is, Mark Zuckerberg opens up. So I spent 2 weeks with Mark to do this long-ass 8,000-word article. And Mark is actually a pretty friendly guy. And at one point I convinced him to take a walk with me, just he and I, from his office to his house, back to his office. He lived like 10 blocks from work. And during this long walk, I asked, without his handlers, like really uncomfortable questions, like, hey, did you steal this, did you steal the idea from the Winklevi? Stuff like that, right? Like, hey, I'm a journalist, I'm supposed to ask hard questions. And in the middle of this long walk, Zuckerberg turned to me and says, yeah, so Jose, where are you from? And I've actually said this to Mark. That question just kind of untangled everything for me. All I knew was I always wanted to live in the West Village since I saw Woody Allen films. I've always wanted to write for the New Yorker. I've always wanted to be the kind of person that could afford anything I wanted. I've always wanted to support my family in the Philippines and my siblings in the Philippines. I was as successful as I could get. And Zuckerberg asked me where I'm from, and I couldn't answer him. I physically stopped. I gave him an eyebrow look thing. And I was just kind of like, I'm done, dude. I'm done. And where I'm from is a place where I hadn't seen my mom at that point for 18 years. She can't come here. She got denied in a tourist visa. And, my grandparents couldn't petition her because she was married and not single. There's the complication of the immigration code. Where I'm from is a place where I felt like such a coward. I felt like every day undocumented people were getting, stereotyped, and these laws were starting to pass. Arizona was happening at the time. And what was I doing? I was living in my comfortable little apartment, doing nothing. Where I'm from is, I just snapped. And Tanya here, by the way, is being a little too modest. I think it was this year, that she walked inside of an ICE office in Philadelphia and got arrested. How long were you in jail for? Sorry. 24 hours. How can you not join them? So, I decided what I was going to do this was, instead of my friends, at that point about 5 people knew. 5 of my closest friends knew. One of my friends who was a reporter for the New York Times said, why don't you just give the story to some reporter and then they could write the story? I'm like, no. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to write this myself. So that was the time that I got to know all you kind people. I met with 24 lawyers in a span of 3 months. Stanford Law Clinic, somebody connected me to the Yale Law Clinic, a friend was teaching there. I started reaching out to people. I hired a lawyer for a week and then realized, okay, this is not going to work out. It was all no, you can't do that. I'm like, wait a second, I've heard no my whole life, and you're not going to tell me no. I know, I wasn't being disrespectful, I was just trying to think okay. And every lawyer but one told me that I shouldn't do this. But I did. Isn't that a horrible photo? It's a horrible photo. So here's the coming out essay, and this is my second time coming out, and I'm totally done coming out. done. So this was it. But I just want to give you like an image. So when I got the dummy for this, a dummy is like when you're about to go to press and you're copy editing, you're just making sure there's no, the last thing you wanted was like a mistake in a 4,000 word story about lying, right? And so like I had to make sure that like, everything was corrected. So I emailed this to 10 lawyers, to 10 of the lawyers at the time who was advising me. And they were just reviewing it. One of my favorite people is a woman named Sin Yen Ling, who's a lawyer for the Asian Law Caucus at the time, who was one of the people that said, Jose, I'm not sure, Jose. I'm just not sure this is a good idea. So Sin Yen, it was 1 hour, I was on the 8th floor of the New York Times building in 42nd Street in New York, closing this article, looking for mistakes. Sin Yen comes calling, and she says, you cannot print this paragraph. But I'm still an undocumented immigrant, and that means living a different kind of reality. It means going about my day in fear of being found out. It means rarely trusting people, even those closest to me with who I really am. It means keeping my family photos in a shoebox, rather than displaying them on shelves in my home so friends don't ask about them. It means reluctantly doing things I know are wrong and unlawful. Sin Yen, you cannot say you're doing things that are wrong and unlawful in the New York Times, in black and white, Jose. I'm like, Sin Yen, I have to turn this in an hour. And she goes, can't you find another phrase? I'm like, no, that's the phrase. You're a writer. You can't find another term for this? I'm like, no, Sin Yen, this is what it is. I'm sorry, what was that?
Mistakes were made.
Mistakes were made. By the way, I've asked Sin Yen for her permission to share this anecdote. But it is what it is. If I'm not going to say this, then why write it? If I'm not going to tell people how I got the driver's license, if I'm not going to tell people what happened on Social Security card, of course, my lawyers were like telling me, well, if you say this, you're going to be disbarring yourself from any sort of relief that we can apply for. It's in print. But it is what it is. So we publish it. I didn't think anybody would read it, frankly. Who's going to care about a 4,000 word on immigration with an Asian dude on thing? I was like, who's? But seems like people read it. And then I went on this crazy media blitz. And mind you, I covered a presidential campaign. I'm used to, I've done TV, but this was a whole different category, right? Going on Colbert, going on Bill O'Reilly, talking to Lou Dobbs, all that stuff. And the whole time I'm thinking to myself, why haven't they deported me? They're deporting at that point, 1,000 people every day? At that point in 2011, 450,000 people were deported. I was getting a petition from Dream Activists, the group that Tanya mentioned, every day. And yet there I am, a walking, uncomfortable conversation, visibly visible, and no one was talking. No one. At one point, I saw a couple of ICE agents in Washington, D.C., and we waved at each other and walked in the opposite direction. So I decided, I called the editor of Time magazine, and I said, I want to write about the fact that I haven't gotten deported. I know. My lawyers are... and so Rick Stengel, the editor, was like, are you sure? I'm like, yes. So I did it. So I wrote this, one of the last things I did for that article, I spent 2 months writing it. It was an even longer story than the original New York Times essay. So I contacted ICE myself. Hi, I'm Jose, I'm writing for Time magazine, and I need to know why I haven't heard from you. Are you going to deport me when? Why not? The person on the other line was like, what are you doing? And mine was like, what are you doing? I mean, it was really kind of surreal. So we published the article, and then the people, the photo editor of Time magazine said, oh yeah, so, we're going to put you on the cover. We already did that. It was horrible. Look at this. So I said, no, I don't want to do that. Why don't we, ask 30 other people on the cover with me? The editor, I'll never forget this, he goes, where are you going to find them? Are you kidding me? There are 500,000 undocumented people in New York, just in New York, right? And so what do? Like, thankfully for Facebook, Twitter, I friended Tanya, I think, on Facebook, because when I read your Daily Pennsylvanian coming out story, I friended her. She didn't know me. Thankfully, she accepted. Followed her on Twitter. So she was one of the 35 people that I called. I said, I need you to go to New York, like tomorrow. I couldn't tell them what the magazine was for, what the magazine was. I couldn't tell them that it was going to be the cover, because at that point, can you imagine if I told them that they're going to be the cover and then they're not on the cover, then I would let people down. But we flew 35 people across the country to a photo studio in Manhattan. Just imagine this. 35 undocumented people from 15 different countries in a photo studio in Manhattan. And one of the most surreal moments was the photo editor started passing around the release forms, asking for people's names and addresses. And the young people just started looking at each other going, Jose, can we trust them? And the people put their addresses down, and this was the cover. I gotta tell you, by the way, that day was the best professional day of my life. I felt like I had done my job. So the guy at the very front, to my left, is Victor from Alabama, who crossed from Mexico when he was 6. He's now 22. Victor had never flown outside of Alabama, and we got him a Mexican passport to go through TSA. I was literally on the phone with him as he was going to the airport to coach him how to get through TSA without flipping out. You know, like when you show your passport, don't shake. Have a backpack on. Have a laptop so that you look like a student. When you get through the TSA line, because you're going to get through, don't smile. Don't act like, oh my God, awesome, I got through. Just slide right in. And I remember he called me and he was like, I'm in. And I was like, oh gosh, great. But the beautiful thing about this is I wasn't in charge of the headline, the cover, We Are Americans. It was the two editors, both of them happened to be white. All they had to do was spend 8 hours next to all these young people, and they couldn't call them anything more than We Are Americans, just not legally. This is what I know to do. Of course, after this was published, I think 2 days after, the Obama administration announced deferred action, which was great. Unfortunately, it was 30 and under, and I had just turned 31, and so I didn't make the cutoff, it's fine. Well, not really. My grandmother wasn't happy about that. But I'm not a policy wonk. All I know is my life and our lives have been played political football with. You know, being gay, being undocumented, and all that stuff. All I really know to do, and all I've really done, is kind of hold on to who I am and find comfort and solace and a great deal of peace knowing that whatever it is that I'm going through, other people are going through the exact same thing. And if anything, they're going through something a lot harder than what I'm going through. And this is kind of where I want to end this before I take your questions, is I don't know if you know this is the 50th year of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech this summer. The March on Washington is going to be this year, 50 years. I first met Martin Luther King's writing when I was in 8th grade. Mr. Zahner gave us a book to read called Letter from Birmingham Jail. At that point, I didn't know it was undocumented. I was in 8th grade. I thought everything, it was cool. I remember how confused I was by this book. It was just really confusing to me. It was confusing to me specifically because of these 3 sentences, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. I didn't understand the first thing, because what's an unjust law? Aren't laws just? So why is a law unjust? I was in 8th grade, I didn't know. And the last one, the third one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And in a way, that's what Tanya, that's what I am, that's what 11 million people are doing every day in this country, is forcing this country to look at itself and ask itself what it's really about. Ask itself to consider and to remember its own history. And to me, the question of how do you define American? It's really a question that is way beyond immigration. It's a question of citizenship. It's a question of what we value in this country. And not only what our past is, but what our future is going to look like. I don't live in a black or white, legal versus illegal paradigm. I live in what's called a really messy gray area, which is what all our individual complicated lives are made out of. As we talk about immigration reform this year, and as immigration reform happens in Washington this year, I think we have to remember, to me, the two key things. One is inclusivity. Who is going to be included? Conversely, who's going to be left out? And the second, and to me, which was the biggest gift that James Baldwin ever gave me, is empathy. Empathy. Which cannot be divorced from equality. So, thank you so much for having me here. Gentleman with a mic thing, and when you ask a question, can you intro yourself, please, and where you're from? That'd be great. Do you go to school here? Do you represent an organization or whatever? You have to ask me a question, else you're gonna make me nervous.
Jose, I follow you on Twitter. I am.
I'm awesome.
Edward.
I'm sorry about all the Beyonce tweeting, man. I'm sorry, no sense.
I'm Edward Alden, Ted for short at the.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I'm like you, a policy wonk, but I was also a writer for years, a journalist for many years. So I appreciated your stories about trying to climb up the ladder. I actually want to share a story too from a talk I gave yesterday to a group of business students. A bunch of whom were from Arizona. It was a very kind of mixed group, and I was telling them about the situation at the border. I've actually been brought in by DHS to look at some of their data on the border, on people crossing in from Mexico into the United States. And it's quite interesting because for about the last 12 years, they have kept records of everybody catch multiple times because they fingerprint people when they're caught in the vicinity of the border by the Border Patrol. And they keep all these records. They have all this data. None of it's been released publicly, and there are a bunch of us pressuring them to try to do that. But then when I looked at the data, I noticed there was a record. A lot of people, get caught 2 or 3 times in a single year. One guy got caught 70 times. and 70 times in a single year. And I told this story to this class yesterday, and sort of expected them to frown by repeat law breaking. And they looked at me and said, "Wow, that guy really wanted to be here. We should just let him in." And I want to say to you, it's you and all of the people here have shown that same kind of tenacity in just fighting it every day. And the fact that those of us who work in Washington, I think see a real possibility this year for immigration reform legislation for the first time. I think it's because of people like you and how you've changed the conversation. So I just want to say thank you.
I'm just following the leaders. That's kind of what I'm doing. But back to that point, by the way, because I was just in Wisconsin. It was a really interesting event. Because some undocumented, the university didn't know that they had undocumented students, and then they all showed up at this symposium thing that ended up leading. It was really fascinating. But we had this great conversation about, in some ways, I would argue that undocumented people who are fighting to be here, are actually showing Americans what it's like to be American. You hear so much talk about the decline of the republic, to quote Gore Vidal, right? America is in the decline, right? The empire is falling apart. I don't know, man. Talk to some immigrants who are starting businesses, who have lives here. If you want to know, this is frustrating. It's hard. But the optimism and the level of commitment to this country. Even though people, I remember a woman from Mississippi who's actually an American citizen, born here from Mexico. She's born here, her parents are from Mexico. She said to me, Jose, I hate that name, Define American. I hate it. She said to me on Facebook. I'm like, I hate it because I can't define it. I don't know what it is. All I know is my whole life, American people have rejected me. And so now you're asking me to embrace something that's completely had always rejected me, and I don't understand why you're trying to do that. And I said, because I want, to me, that's the question, right? And it's not something that's an easy, I'm a journalist, I'm not interested in easy questions and easy answers, right? What I am interested in is at least some sort of a conversation, that's outside of the whole border security, US-Mexico border realm, which is even our own president hasn't gotten away from, rhetorically. So, thank you.
Hi, I'm Hiro Nishikawa.
From Mountain View.
Well, yeah, I grew up near there. I was in a incarceration camp in Pullitzer, Arizona, as a kid, from 3 to 7 years of age. My grandparents had immigrated to the United States with papers around 1900. Yet in 1942, the United States government abrogated due process and constitutional rights and sent 110,000 people into prison, basically into prison. And so your story resonated because, as MLK's word said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So I appreciate your stories, and you keep telling them. They're great.
Oh, thank you. Can I just make a comment about that? I gotta tell you though, let's talk about privilege. I am privileged to be doing what I'm doing. I'm privileged to have the connections that I have and the resources that I have. What I hadn't even told you is when I was going to come out in the New York Times, it was originally meant for the Washington Post, where I had worked for 5 years. And then at the very last minute, the editors got cold feet and killed it. They just killed the story. They said, we can't publish this anymore. So thankfully, I called a friend at the New York Times, and they're like, oh, we'll publish it, which ended up being a better thing. But there are so many undocumented people in this country every day who can't even tell their own story because there's so much freaking noise. And so I feel this incredible amount of guilt sometimes doing what I'm doing. So originally I was supposed to do a documentary. I was going to do like a Waiting for Superman style documentary on dreamers. Right? Like I found 6 really kind of surprising stories. An undocumented Jew from Israel, Victor from Alabama. I found all these great stories, and we're going to try to tell 6 of them in this documentary. And I filmed 90 hours of footage, which is pretty traditional for a documentary, for a feature-length doc. I showed it to some friends, and then they're like, Jose, when are you going to realize that, the movie is actually your mom? How can you do a movie on immigration where you're telling people stories and not talk about your mom, Jose? Because I don't know how to talk about her. I don't know how to talk about something you haven't seen for 20 years. I don't know how to do that. I know how to be successful. That I know how to do. But to talk about my mom and talk about what was lost. So I sent a film crew to the Philippines over Christmas to film her. And I actually just saw the footage 2 weeks ago because we wanted to wait until I started really editing the film. The film is going to premiere in mid-June. To see my mom move, I was like, that's immigration, right? So, and I'm telling you this because, I'm amongst friends and we're all fighting in the same fight. And I almost want to apologize. I feel like I'm taking so much space. Sometimes I feel like, here I am, I plop myself in the middle of this. There's all these young people who have been doing this longer than I have. There's all these advocates, and then I plop myself in the middle of it and take so much space. And I guess all I'm really doing in the past couple of years is owning my own story. It's ironic. I spent my entire adult life writing about other people, and I never wanted to face kind of my own story. And I guess that's what I'm doing, and doing it in a really public way, in a really kind of painful way. Sometimes I wish I was just writing about this person, you know? Yeah, so I just wanted to say that. Yes?
Three quick points. I hope they're quick. First of all, some of us in the room had the privilege of being taught by Ed Sparrow, after whom this event is named. And were he with you today, he'd be very happy to hear from you. And you're right up his alley, I think. Secondly, I think that most of us, if not all of us in the room, feel that rights don't get expanded unless they're pushed for by brave people like you and Tanya. So thank you very much for doing this.
Oh, thank you.
And thirdly, I wondered in listening to your personal narrative whether it's occurred to you that some of what you've experienced is very similar to what people have experienced, say, in World War II or the refugee experience, and how that might be a basis for a coalition.
Okay, wow, you tipped me off there. So in the next few weeks, Define American, this organization this campaign that we have, we're partnering up. We got the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, involved. Abe Foxman is really into this, which is great. The NAACP and GLAAD, and we're all going to kind of team up and challenge the New York Times and the other media organizations to stop using the word illegal to refer to immigrants. But that coming from Abe Foxman at ADL and coming from Ben Jealous at the NAACP, gives a whole other context to it. I recently met with an Italian organization in New Jersey who's going to jump on board. I didn't even know that WAPS stood for Without Papers. Did you all know that?
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know that. I knew it was WAPS, but I didn't know that it was Without Papers. And so this woman contacted me, and so we're going to do this entire campaign with them that they used to say we were illegal, except they just called us WAPS. But again, connecting those dots, right, to me is so important in this work. And to make sure that, we do justice to our own history. And that's why I'm so glad that you mentioned the internment camps. When American citizens who happen to be Japanese were considered enemies by their own country. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which is why all this talk about legalization versus path to citizenship, haven't we done this already? Didn't we make these mistakes already? Do we want to do them again? But as far as I'm concerned, if we don't get the rest of America, white America, black America, Jewish America, Italian America, to say, wait up. This has to be full citizenship. So, thank you for that. We have a few more questions. How much time do I have left, Allison? 5 minutes. Okay, great. I'm sorry, I have to catch an Amtrak.
I'm Howard Chang. I'm a law professor here at Penn Law School.
Sorry, I don't.
I'm back
great.
here.
Oh, cool.
I really like your last slide, which raises the question, casts doubt on the justice of our immigration laws. But it raises a question about that sentence in your coming out piece, the one that your lawyer objected to, saying that you've done things that are wrong and unlawful.
Yes.
You may have done things that are unlawful. Do you actually believe that they were wrong?
No, I didn't. I didn't believe they were wrong. But wait a second. Sarah, thank you for pointing that out. But I had a team of people, friends, who were helping me come out with this, right? Jose, if you don't say you're wrong, we can't get you on Mike Huckabee's show. You have to admit fault, Jose. You have to admit fault. We can't just preach to the choir. I don't know if I did this video thing that accompanied the article. I don't know if you've seen it. It's kind of bad, but I did this video thing. We shot it for 2 nights because I couldn't say, the line was, I am sorry for breaking our country's laws. That was the line in the script. And one of my best friends, Jamu Green, she used to run Rock the Vote, so she's badass woman, She's like, Jose, she was directing me in this thing. You have to say that line. But I'm not. What was I supposed to do? Jose, if we're going to reach beyond the progressive circle, you have to admit fault. I threw a fit. I went to the bathroom. I think I punched the wall. Jimu got really upset. She walked out. She's like, I don't condone that kind of violence, punching walls. I got her back in. But it was really tough. But to even say, I'm sorry I broke our country's laws, because it's my country too. I dare you to say that I'm not American. I dare you. I've gone to some Tea Party meetings, bringing my tax forms, my Social Security form, the Time magazine cover. I'm here. I dare you to say that I'm not American. I dare you. So, it's been hard trying to figure out how do I make sure that I'm preaching beyond the choir, but then how do I make sure that I can be at peace with how I'm presenting myself? I'm not a politician. I'm not running for office. I don't want to run for office ever. So that's been kind of weird. But thank you for only a lawyer would
I'd like to address the lawyer aspects of some of what the advice you got.
Yeah.
And actually I want to speak specifically to Tanya and some of the DREAM activists in terms of this. I was in Pennsylvania's capital, Harrisburg, on one of the lobby days when a number of the Dreamers came with us to confront our pretty regressive state legislators. And I remember several of them specifically cornering Representative Metcalf in a corner and saying, wearing the shirts that say I am undocumented, and making him come face to face with them. And I think that I've been representing immigrants for close on 40 years. And as a lawyer, I have a lot of lawyers' cautions, as do most of those who advised you, about what I advise my clients to do. And I think for those who are law students here struggling with how do you represent activists? How do you let people not be disempowered by the conservative advice we have to give them? We have a duty to give them. But accept that people can make choices both ways. It's something that's really important. And when I say both ways, let me just give an example from before IRCA. I represented a 13-year-old child who worked in a mushroom operation and who was there with his father, and this is 1984. And the kid had a pitchfork that had been stuck into his leg by a farmer, mushroom grower, because he hadn't been doing the task he wanted him to do. And the father and the child made the decision that they could not do anything about that because of their immigration status and because of not jeopardizing that immigration status. And that, to me, was such an outrage. And I think that it's really, really important for us to be able to feel the outrage and to be able to reach beyond it to try to make some changes in those unjust laws.
Thank you. I had an email. I was in, where was I? I was somewhere. I forget. A student came up to me, a dreamer came up to me at a college that I was just invited. The college Republicans invited me to come. I came and we had a big conversation. This dreamer came up to me and said, Jose, I'm tired of seeing you on TV and stuff, and you never seem to get angry. Can you get a little angrier? Because he thinks I'm too, he was saying that he was tired of me being so conciliatory. That was the word that he used. He said, can we see you, angry more? And I looked at him, and then I got angry. And I was like, of course I'm angry. Are you out? This is a farce. It's a farce. It's a farce in the way that, you all know we're here. You all know you benefit from us. You all know that we can't all just babysit your kids and mow your lawns and serve you drinks. So what do you want to do with us? The ball is in your court. It's always been in your court. So I feel like I always have to calm myself down, especially when I do. I've done O'Reilly 5 times now. And he just gets on my face, but I know that 2 million people are watching, many of whom have never seen anybody like me or heard from somebody like me. And I know that because I live in America, in which we fight for our freedom. And I'm saying this as an undocumented person. I remember when living in the city was the first time I had been exposed to poverty. Going to the ghettos, going to kind of the housing projects in the city. And I remember thinking to myself, wait a second. These are people born in this country who are American citizens who are treated like second-class citizens just because they happen to be black and poor. So I just feel like I need to be, for me, I've always wanted to get myself to a place where I can have a conversation with people and not let my anger, as this young man said, he said, why don't you tie yourself to a fence in the White House? I bet you they'd do something. I'm like, no, that's not what I've thought a lot about, why don't I just walk, in an ICE office and follow Tanya's lead and do that? Why don't I go do, I'm kind of pushing my own boundaries and trying to figure out what can I do that feels most organic and most authentic to who I am. And all I really worry about a lot personally is my grandmother. I put her through hell. I put that woman through hell. And I just tell her that, stay healthy, keep walking every day, because, when I get a passport, we'll finally, travel and go to, South Africa, Canada. I learned English because of Anna Green Gables, Prince Edward Island. I think that's all the time I have. So thank you so much. And by the way, thank you for all that you do.